In 2017, a woman who moved to Nevada from Ohio would have begun to have a series of the most bizarre and equally frightening visitations. But she's not alone, because there are others who have seen and experienced bizarre and frightening things very similar to Ashley's experiences. In today's episode, I'm going to share with you 4 truly strange stories of the unexplained that will make you uncomfortable. You won't want to miss this one. In March of 2017, Ashley had just moved from her place in Ohio down to Nevada to a small double-wide trailer with a roommate. She was basically just looking to downsize to save a little rent money and just for a different view other than what she had already been in. And so on this particular night, she had actually decided to head to bed earlier than usual because she was informed that she had to be at work very early the following day. And so she wanted to get a little extra sleep and just to kind of be ahead of schedule. And so she goes to bed, she crashes out, and she is out for the night. But not all is as it seems. Now, at some point in the middle of the night, Ashley bolts upright in her bed. And you ever have those feelings where just something isn't right? Well, that's exactly what she experienced. It's like your gut instincts are just screaming at you to pay attention to your surroundings, and this is exactly what Ashley was experiencing. However, Ashley's looking around her bedroom and she can't find any explanation as to why her gut reaction is telling her that something is clearly wrong. The only thing that's in her room is just complete darkness. There's no sounds at all, and so she just figures, what the heck? And she lays her head back down, tries to go back to sleep, and she can't quite calm her body and mind enough to try and fall back into a restful sleep. And so she's kind of in that in-between stage, but there's still this nagging sensation that something is really, really wrong. And so at some point, she just kind of opens her eyes, and she notices off in the corner there's this strange black shape with what appears to be tentacles kind of just wiggling along the corner of her bedroom and her ceiling. Now, immediately she's like, what? And, she's rubbing her eyes, just trying to make sense of what she's seeing, trying to make sure that she's not half asleep or something, but that this figure is still there. And so she's thinking to herself, okay, there's got to be a car or some sort of light being cast outside that would cause this strange shadow to appear on my ceiling wall. And so she actually kind of sits up and looks off in the direction of the window, but doesn't see anything that would cause this. But as soon as she does this, she notices this man that walks past her window, and she immediately gasps because she's taken aback. And the second that happens, this man instantly stops and begins to walk up to her window, looks in and looks directly at her. And as she's looking at this man who's looking at her in her window, she begins to feel the blood drain from her face because she notices that there's something very off about this man. Half of his face is literally melting off of his skull, and he's actually communicating with her, but not with his mouth. He's communicating with her telepathically, and he's telling her things like,
hey, come out here. I want to show you something. You'll really like it. Just come out and see.
And so she's completely petrified by what she's saying, and she's just responding back in her head, no, F you, F you, F you, F you, go away, leave me alone, over and over again, forcing herself with all her might just to push her face back into her pillow and fall back asleep. She's trying to convince herself this was just some horrific nightmare. And the whole time this is going on, this man is just kind of darting and pacing back and forth outside her window, his eyes never leaving her. He's always watching, and he continuously demands that she come outside to meet him. And finally, after some time had gone by, he just ups and vanishes. Now, for a brief moment there, she was convinced that she would actually get a break, and maybe now she could try to get some sleep like she so desperately needed. But we know how these stories go, folks. That wasn't about to happen just yet. Instantly, her attention is brought to a noise over from her closet. Oh, and she could soon feel the tension rising in her entire body. And then she notices the sliding door of the closet begin to slowly crack open, And a terrifying realization comes over her. She was not alone. That something was in the house with her. Now, you could imagine that Ashley having just experienced this horrific man outside, and now there's something in her closet. So she's in a real living nightmare, and she just begins to sob and cry, and she doesn't know what else to do. And out of the blackness, she hears something so off-putting. It's this strange, slow, sincere voice coming from the direction of the closet that tells her, "It's all right. Don't worry. I'm here." And this is a very strange reassurance. It was completely out of the ordinary. And then shortly, this figure steps forward so she could see it or him or whatever it is. Now, standing there in the center of the room was a man that was dressed in very fine clothing and a satin top hat. But there was one striking feature that set this man apart from everyone else. And that was what sat underneath the hat was not a human head, but rather that of a crow or a raven. And so this figure would look back to her closet where these two other humanoid figures kind of swung back and forth, and they wore these blank, empty expressions as well. The whole thing is very bizarre. And he turns his attention back to Ashley. Now he raises his left hand and places his right hand on his suit and begins to kind of cock his head much the way a bird would, looking down at Ashley. And then he asks her telepathically a question, and that is, "You could see me, but you're not running away." And so these two would actually go on to have this bizarre telepathic conversation that she would describe being more like deep personal therapy rather than confronting. And this thing would ask her all sorts of strange questions like, why do you think you're having trouble sleeping, and what's going on at your job that's currently stressing you out? All of this conversation going on between them telepathically until eventually she just told it, "Look, I'm really tired. I'm happy we got to talk, but I really need sleep. I have to get up for work early in the morning." And so this figure just simply nods its head and cocks its head much the way a bird does and kind of recedes back a little bit and tells her to rest well, that it will be there. And so you can imagine at this point that she's thoroughly convinced she's either crazy or having the most lucid dream of her entire life. But the things to come in the story would prove otherwise. Now, she somehow managed to fall asleep, but until she had to get up for work the following morning, she would wake up several times and would look over to see this strange crow figure just sitting down on the ground, looking outside her window, just kind of acting as a guardian, I guess you could call it. And she wasn't really sure what to make of it. I mean, she wasn't exactly feeling off-put, but it was kind of comforting in a way. So the next morning comes, she wakes up, he's not there, and everything seems relatively normal for the time being. It's like nothing ever happened. So she just gets up, goes to work like normal, but during the course of the whole day, she just felt like, I don't know, something was different, And she couldn't tell any of her friends, family, or coworkers about what she had experienced the night prior because how absolutely crazy would all this sound to them? And so the day goes by and she just keeps thinking about it and replaying the events in her head of the night before, and she realizes that, no, I was awake during this. This was not a dream. And so this would just replay in her head for several more days as she kept trying to wrestle with the thought that this wasn't a dream, that this really happened in her head the entire time, and this couldn't possibly be reality. I mean, this sort of thing doesn't happen to healthy, functional, normal people. But one evening, she then returned home from a night of work just like any other, and her roommate had actually stopped her and began having small talk with her and just, catching up. And then she asks her a question that really off-put her. And that was that if she had anybody over the other night, which immediately put Ashley on guard because she's like, why would you ask that? No, I didn't. And so they began to talk with her and tell her, well, whoever you had over the other night, they must have really irritated you because you were really screaming at this person, whoever you had invited over into your room, not screaming words, but screaming like, screaming like a mad woman. And so, of course, Ashley did not know how to respond because she did not remember screaming at all, and she never had invited anybody over. And so Ashley began thinking that maybe this entire time her memories of this, peaceful figure was completely incorrect. That there had to have been something in her bedroom that was possibly preying on her or had nefarious intentions. Well, 2 months goes by after this initial experience, and she's actually getting back from feeding some horses, and it's about 9 o'clock or so at night. And during this time of year, because it's pretty much summer, the sun's still out very late, and so it's definitely getting dimmer in the evening. And after she gets back, she gets a text message from one of her neighbors. Now, this is a kind of neighbor who kind of looks out for everybody in the neighborhood. They kind of know everybody. I mean, the town's only like 65 people. So if there's somebody who's not supposed to be here, you're gonna notice. And so the text is actually from this guy's wife, and she's like, "Hey, my husband said that you had somebody walking with you that he didn't recognize. And as a matter of fact, this person walking with you was following you back from the stables back to your house, and he wore dark clothing and a dark robe and just looked odd. Are you sure?" Basically, this woman's husband had never seen this guy before, and so he was really concerned for her. And at this point, she's completely off-put and confused by this text message, because she's like, "No, it was only me with my dog, and we were there alone the entire time. She never saw anybody. There was nobody else following her. There was no rational way to explain this at all." And during all of this, she would sometimes find dead crows on the ground and would hear the occasional raven or crow calling in the distance. But whenever she would look around to respond or even react to the noise, well, there'd be no bird in sight. And even now, as I tell this story to all of you, Ashley is still getting visited by this strange figure that she claims comes and watches over her at night. Ashley is a person who does not drink or take any recreational prescribed drugs of any kind, and swears that she is of sound mental health, despite how absolutely unbelievable her experience is. But the only thing she can think of is that what she is experiencing is clearly supernatural in nature. What is interesting is that a friend of hers had heard about her experiences and actually told her that supposedly in some Native American cultures that crows are actually supposed to be good omens, despite all the negative experiences that were actually happening to Ashley. This being has been infamously named the Crowman, and unfortunately remains a mystery. Before I start this next story, I just want to make an interesting observation about sleep deprivation in the paranormal. I know that a lot of experiences people would simply write off due to sleep deprivation and being in that, kind of half dreamlike state, but others talk about being in a different vibrational state, making you more susceptible to seeing into the unseen realm when you're actually sleep deprived. That it's actually the lack of sleep that would send an individual into an altered state of consciousness where they're able to see things more clearly. In fact, years ago, Joel had been suffering from severe sleep deprivation. And at this point, he had been awake for 36 staggering hours straight and was doing his best to try to fall asleep. And unfortunately, he was very unsuccessful. And so he's just laying in bed, he's completely exhausted, but his brain won't shut down and he is wide awake. And so he notices something out of the corner of his eye, and he looks and he sees this bizarre thing flying around the room. And he notices that it's green and translucent and actually lands right into his lap. And so he's just kind of shaking his head, trying to process this and saying that, "Listen, I am just beyond exhausted. I am hallucinating my butt off. There's no way this is real." Because what's in his lap is a dinosaur with wings. And now he's just kind of laughing to himself, and he understands clearly that this is all just sleep-deprived hallucinations. There's nothing real about it. And not to mention the dogs that are laying with him in bed, they take no notice of any of this, which again validates that this is nothing more than hallucinations. And so a few minutes go by, and he sees this little horned devil riding around, flying around on motorcycles, and it actually swoops down from him from the ceiling. And just as this is going on, he's realizing how absurd and ridiculous all of this is, and just that he desperately wants his brain to shut down so he can go to sleep. He's tired of this. But things would change with what happens next. This black mist begins to form in his room and slowly reaches its way up the ceiling and into the direction of where he and his bed is. And what's really creepy here is that both of his dogs instantly take notice of this thing and begin growling with their hackles raised, and they're just kind of whining, and they're clearly responding to whatever this is. And so now Joel is thinking, okay, something's definitely not right. And this black mist or mass just kind of forms right over where Joel is laying, hits the wall, and then kind of transforms into this shadow, as he describes it. And what happens next is far more terrifying. As it begins to take a more defined shape, he notices that it starts to look like a human, just with long black spindly fingers, but the head is slightly different. Now keep in mind that the entire time this is happening in front of him, both of his dogs are tracking it religiously, something they weren't doing with any other of the hallucinations he was having. There is clearly something happening that they too are reacting and seeing. And so he's like, you know what, I can't handle this. He's scared, he gets up, he's petrified. Him and the dogs, they take out of the room, and as he gets out to the kitchen, he begins to see these strange spirits walking around and kind of doing what he described as a loop. And each spirit was very old-timey with Victorian clothing. Now, thinking he just lost his marbles, he steps outside to smoke a cigarette, and he's clearly watching this, Apache warrior charge him with a tomahawk. Now, while none of these other hallucinations that he experienced during this really bothered him or frightened him at the time, the one entity or hallucination he saw in his room was different, and it completely terrified him. And it had one thing in common with the rest of the stories in this video. Remember how I talked about how the face or head was different? Well, the face appeared to have a large beak of some kind. And as a matter of fact, it's also the only hallucination that he had that evening where his dogs very clearly not only saw it, but reacted to it. Now, as far as the entity or hallucination that Joel saw that evening and its connection to these other strange bird-like entities that people are seeing remains unknown. In November of 1962, a Mr. S was on a very routine trip through the beautiful French countryside. This particular region featured winding dark landscapes that hugged the coast of Var, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's French, so go easy on me. And so on this particular evening, it's very dark and stormy, and the rain is just coming down in heavy sheets. And in fact, it's so heavy that without functioning windshield wipers, the guy probably wouldn't be able to see the road ahead of him. Now, it's important to understand that this is just a normal routine drive with nothing remarkable or anything happening out of place. All he can see in front of him is just the blur of the constant rain. But this mundane drive would soon change in an instant. As Mr. S is driving along this road, he notices that the road actually begins to curve to the left ahead of him. And so naturally, like anybody would do, he begins to slow his vehicle, and even through the thick rain and mist, he begins to see something that's out of place. And as he begins to slow down his vehicle even more, he's kind of squinting and he's looking out his windshield, just trying to make sense of what he's looking at. And there he sees a trio of figures that are apparently just standing in the middle of the road. Now, you have to understand that what he's seeing is incredibly out of place. I mean, it's wet, it's cold, they're in the middle of a torrential downpour. And so immediately after seeing this, he's just trying to hit the brakes because he doesn't want to hit these poor people. And Mr. S is thinking that these poor people are stuck out here in the rain, that their car probably broke down nearby, they're desperate, they have nowhere to go, they're not sure what to do. So doing the good Samaritan thing, he kind of just creeps closer, begins to roll down his driver's side window, and he's going to ask them if they need any help. But now, as soon as he slows down enough to roll down his window to say something to these three people, these three figures rush toward him and completely frighten the guy. Now, by their actions alone, it's clear that they did not have good intentions. And so, instantly frightened, Mr. S slams the pedal to the metal and he flies out of there. And he's completely off-put and panicked by what he just saw, and he's trying to process things in his mind. And so he gets roughly about 1/10 of a mile down the road where he actually kind of just pulls over and stops his vehicle altogether. And he's just trying to be like, did I really just see that? Like, what? What he saw just didn't make any sense. However, what happened in the following few minutes would forever change his perspective on the world in which we live in, because it was so bizarre. And in fact, he would later be approached by ufologist Lionel Trigano to discuss his bizarre experience. And this experience would actually make it into a published issue of the very popular British UFO magazine, Flying Saucer Review, in 1968. It's also important to understand something, and that this wasn't just a typical UFO sighting or a man driving along the road that sighted small green men. No, it's not that simple. What he saw when he nearly stopped his vehicle, rolled down his window, and got a good look is something that defies any logic or understanding. He described 3 people, or at least that was the best he could describe them as, and that their actions were abrupt and very jerky and kind of like they were snapping in a place rather than moving on their own. Now, immediately after rushing towards his vehicle in a very violent and confrontational manner, he was able to see in detail with what light he could what they actually looked like, and describe them as beasts or some kind of bizarre animals with the heads of birds and covered in some sort of feathers. And what's stranger and terrifying is that these beings rushed his vehicle in a way that was strategic. You had one go on the left side, one go on the right side, and one going directly in front of him, as if their goal was to try and trap him in the road. And so fortunately for him, he was able to pull out in time before they were going to do whatever it is they had planned for him. And so as he gets, about 1/10 mile down the road and he's pulling over and he's stopped and he's just trying to process everything, he notices movement in his rearview mirror. And so he looks, and what he sees is just, it's crazy. These 3 beings from just a few minutes ago have now unfurled their wings and are now flying in his direction. Now, at the same time, he also notices off in his right in the sky what he would describe as a large dark blue object kind of just hovering there in the sky. That it was luminous and it just kind of hung over the landscape. Now, it actually reminded him of 2 plates that were upside down but placed on one another. And so these 3 beings flew overhead past him and towards this large object, where one by one, as they drew near, they were literally sucked into this thing by some unseen portal. And within seconds of this happening, this large object kind of emanates this strange dull sound, kind of like a clap or even a cracking sound, and then just vanishes into the sky. It's gone. And like anybody would be, this frightened Mr. S so badly that when he eventually told his report to the ufologist in 1968, he did it under the one condition that there would be strict anonymity. And this was a very level-headed, successful individual who operated a very booming car garage in the region of Aou. By the way, it's another French region that I hope I'm not butchering. Now, in addition, he was also a very brawny, large man who wasn't easily frightened by much. And so him simply misidentifying an animal or just fabricating a report like this just didn't really make a whole lot of sense, especially considering it was the 1960s. Interestingly, his experience, along with several others that describe similar beings, have become more commonly known as the Beast of Vach. There you go. There's a little French for you. Hope I didn't screw that one up. Unfortunately, any additional information regarding to Mr. S's experience and the strange bird-headed humanoids he witnessed that evening truly remain a mystery. In July of 2012, Julian and a friend had taken Julian's sister to a party not too far away from his house. And so after both the men dropped her off, they were deciding ways to try and pass the time before they'd have to go back and pick her up from the party when it was over. And so they were kind of just debating back and forth what to do, and they just ultimately decide to hang out at Julian's house to try and pass the time. And so eventually, when it was time to go pick her back up, they get back in the car. Everything is perfectly normal. And, they're kind of just joking around. They're listening to music. They're just in conversation. But we all know how these stories play out, don't we, guys? And Julian, as he's in conversation with his friend, he's kind of just driving leisurely. You know how, like, when you're looking over and talking at somebody in the passenger seat, you're kind of just looking back at the road casually. It's something that a lot of us do when we have friends or family in the car, when we're just in deep conversation, and someone steps out in the road in front of him. So immediately he reacts like, oh crap, and he goes to swerve, and he honks the horn, and he just barely avoids a collision with this person. Now, if any of you watching have had a remotely similar experience, you can imagine just kind of how shaken up your nerves get, because you're like, holy crap, I almost just got into an accident. I could have killed someone or potentially gotten messed up in some accident. And so Julian looks over at his friend like, oh my gosh, we almost just killed that person. And so they just start talking as they keep driving. And they start to realize that there were a lot of things that were off about the person who had stepped in the road. Now, neither of them got a great look at who this was, but they both agreed that they were able to discern this person was in a large coat, and they could clearly see a pair of legs, and that the person was sporting white feathers. Yeah, like white feathers like you would see on a swan. And so they get a few minutes down the road, and they're both thinking like, wait a minute, this can't be possible. And so they both agree that they should turn around. So the vehicle turns around. They go back to try and scout out to see if maybe there's any signs of where this person was, because if they walked out in the road, they couldn't be that far away. So they drove back to the exact spot, but there was nothing there. No blood, no feathers. No sign of anything being out of the ordinary. Well, Julian and his friend couldn't really make anything of it because there was clearly no evidence or anything ever existing, so they just kind of brushed it off and went back up as normal to go pick up Julian's sister. Well, a few years go by, and they're actually just having conversation with another friend about that memory, and they're chatting, and they actually talk to him about this particular road, and their friend begins to ask the question like, oh, you guys saw the Birdman, right? And immediately, that just opened up all these doors into the possibilities and the legends of what it is that they saw that evening. Now, despite what they saw making no logical sense because nobody sees a person with large white feathers, apparently there are legends of what people call the Birdman in that particular area. And so in 2022, Julian and this friend of his, who he was with during the sighting, would actually reach out in an email to Emma Heard, who runs the website Weird Wiltshire. And the road that these men were traveling down is a road that's apparently known for other creepy sightings and things happening, which I'm gonna have to do a whole separate video on, but the road in question is A3102. I don't know how you say roads in the UK, but I'm assuming that's it. And it's actually right near the Wetham House and is apparently a historical landmark in Wiltshire. Now, as for the mysterious white-feathered figure that stepped out in the road and then vanished without a trace, its identity remains unknown. And since you guys made it this far into the video, I want you to all comment down below the crow, so I know who made it to the end of the episode and who didn't. And if you guys enjoyed today's episode, be sure to go ahead and smack that like and subscribe button for more content like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the very next episode.